Again, just introducing our panelists again. We have Professor Fain from University of Iowa, Professor Grannis, City of Hope, Thomas O'Donnell from Siemens Health and Ears, Professor Raja Subramaniam from I-ELCAP School of Medicine here at Mount Sinai, and Professor Rosemary Vliegenthart from University of Groningen. So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for being here. So our first question for all of you is, how big has the impact been on ordering CT scans? Perhaps,
Speaking from the Sinai experience, I would say it has not had a big impact. In fact, we did run some numbers to see if there was any significant drop in patients coming in for CT, and we didn't see it. Although there was definitely concern from some of the public regarding this paper and concerns they have for their own CTs. We did feel some questions from the patients, but after we explained them the risk versus benefits from getting their scans done, everything went okay for us. That's been our experience at Mount Sinai.
thank you. Sure.
I think the answer is that we don't know how big the impact is. We do know that in the state of California, only about 1% of people have had CT scans. And the only conclusion I can come to is that adverse criticism, positing improbable risks, is scaring people away, scaring doctors away from ordering CT scans. And that's obviously a very bad thing.
Okay. So I'm involved primarily in longitudinal research studies involving chest CT. And I think there's a challenge there as well. As this kind of study comes out, it's harder and harder to recruit people. And then people who are already in studies and you're trying to retain them, this becomes a factor. I mean, I don't know what the impact of this is. It's probably hard to measure, but it can't be helpful. And I think education as well in regards to lung cancer screening, which is also a test that is underutilized. We need to be vigilant about getting the information out to patients so that they're not unnecessarily afraid of this study.
We don't have lung cancer screening yet in the Netherlands, but in clinic, I don't think we've seen a decrease in CT scans. We see an annual increase, and it hasn't changed since April, May.
Excellent. That's all great news. I'm so glad to hear that from our panelists. I feel that at the University of Washington in Seattle, as a cardiac imager, I've definitely noticed a change, not because of this article, but a general sense of that CT may not be as safe as MRI. So for example, there are certain cardiovascular indications where the providers and the patients will prefer an MRI, even though it's an inferior test to CT. And that has two, negative outcomes downstream. Number one, we're wasting time, we're wasting money charging for an exam that's not going to help the patient. And number two is we're actually increasing the backlog of MRIs so that the people who really need MRIs can't get it because someone's occupying the scanner when they should be somewhere else getting a CT. So we're seeing that, definitely we've seen that for a few years now, and I'm not sure, I don't think this article will help. So that being said, we have another question for our panelists. Have societies done a good job regarding clarifying the risks? And do you have any suggestions on what else can be said or what else can be done?
As you mentioned in one of the talks, the AAPM came with a statement on the same day this article was published, where they strongly expressed the fact that the results are model-based, not actual patient data. And the same day, I believe ACR also came up in support of the AAPM statement. And most interestingly, I saw the chair of UCSF supporting the stand of AAPM and had some strong words against this article. Okay. So I would say that we definitely are up with our ball game as far as defending ourselves in terms of use of CT for imaging.
Again, my perspective is from the research perspective and bringing new technologies into play. And just a general statement is that, you know, people are increasingly cynical about medical care and risk. And I think this kind of thing, we need to do a much better job of educating people. I don't think while the response of the societies is great and that saying that the model is not, supported by data is one thing. I think it's also important to make people, more aware of, the technology itself, what the risk is and what the value is, so that they individually can make these decisions. I think there's two different audiences, I guess, is my point.
I agree. I think the societies are doing a good job, as good a job as they can in terms of educating the public. I guess my concern is that to some extent, it almost doesn't matter in terms of what the societies say or what the experiments show. People seem to be kind of led by their fears, and my biggest fear is that someone slips this JAMA article to RFK Jr. and, they just run with it. And it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what, whatever experiments or we have all this evidence that this is not really dangerous for you. There's a lot of evidence that vaccines are good for you. People don't really seem to care. So I think that the societies are doing a good job. I don't really have any advice, oh, you should do this. But I think that the focus has to be getting that message to the public. And they don't necessarily seem to be receptive to it.
Matthew, let me take a little different approach and say that the societies are not doing a very good job. And let me give you one example. I showed you a slide of Robert McCunney, who published 3 articles in Chest in 2014. All of those articles were published in Chest while he was a consultant for Philip Morris. He published the articles while he was being paid for by Philip Morris, which raises the hypothetical question, are those articles a manufactured product of the tobacco industry? So what did Chest do when they were informed that he was testifying in court? They said that it was an oversight and let it slip. So I think in this very specific case of the AACP, in my experience, they've done a terrible job right from the get-go in dealing with the risks, in overblowing the risks and underestimating the benefits of lung cancer screening.
In Europe, we have an ESR, European Society of Radiology initiative called EuroSafe Imaging that also tries to convey the message regarding radiation dose. I think one of the essential issues is make it stupid simple. So make it visual and just so that people can understand what the real risk is, because most people don't understand the text of these kind of statements. But probably neither the referring physician. So if you have a very simple, maybe combined leaflet, whatever online, that really shows like in visual things what this means if you get a CT scan, maybe that's helpful for everybody. Thank you. For patients and referring physicians.
Thank you so much for all those insightful comments. Definitely, it's a very tricky situation, especially with what you mentioned, Tom, regarding politics and policies. I find that when it comes to situations like these, where you're almost in a position where you have to defend your modality or your livelihood, the most convincing evidence has to come from someone from the outside. In other words, if someone comes up with an article saying vaccines are not safe, they're dangerous, and the people who come forward to defend it are, Moderna, Johnson Johnson, Pfizer, the makers of the vaccine. The automatic knee-jerk response of the public is, this is a conflict of interest. Of course, you're going to defend your product, your company. But ideally, what we want to hear who we want to hear from would be family medicine physicians, pediatricians. So same thing with concerns about radiology exams is I don't think it will help for the RSNA or ACR to come forward. It would have to be other groups like emergency medicine physicians, pulmonary medicine physicians, people who have absolutely no stake in the modality. I think that would be the most convincing evidence for the public. And so far we haven't had a lot of that, unfortunately. Another question for the panelists. Will this simply keep going on, or will something finally answer this? Even if the dose is halved again, it still is a big number. At the end of the day, exams will increase in total number, and therefore they will claim more cancer deaths. Do you see any solutions to this in the foreseeable future?
Maybe zero photon imaging. Because, we have come from a situation where you used to have one-size-fits-all protocols to very sophisticated protocols. We have gone through iterations of different dose-saving methods, right? As two of you very nicely put it out there. So I still feel that radiation is still a four-letter word that people have phobia about. And the fact remains that radiation is not as potent a carcinogen compared to other things that we face in everyday life. When I give lecture on radiation safety specifically, I ask people, do you even think twice before picking that processed food from your supermarket shelf? You have no qualms about eating it, but yet when I mention the word radiation, you get alarmed because it's ingrained. So I don't think we'll be able to completely get over it. And as you mentioned, more and more education is the key. And we all need to be in the forefront of education and make people aware.
It's interesting. So because of climate change, nuclear power seems to be, back in vogue. When I was younger, people were completely freaked out about the idea of nuclear plants and they're gonna melt down, China syndrome, and now people seem to be kind of comfortable with that. I find this kind of hard to balance in my head. In answer to this question, I'm not sure if even if you have the dose again, or there's some great big study that is going to, ultimately somehow determine whether linear threshold model works or not, or whatever. Does it matter in the end? It's hard to say. I have a sister, and she had a friend who was going to have an MR, not a CT, an MR, and she was worried about the result, the effects of the exam. Now I should point out that she was worried about her psychic abilities being compromised, but people have these kind of ideas about things. So we can do all the research we want. I'm not sure it's going to solve this.
In terms of solutions, I mean, one of the solutions is for journals to follow their own rules. So, the topic of this talk is the Smith-Binman article. And that article, she claims that Alara Imaging Corporation has no influence whatsoever on her publication. But in 2014, she spoke before Congress and got Congress to mandate radiologists to report dose. That was never done. In 2019, the University of California, San Francisco was given a contract to do this work. In May of 2020, Binman and her husband formed a corporation called Alara Imaging Corporation. On December 24th, Christmas Eve 2020, two CMS employees worked on Christmas Eve to give them a no-bid government contract to report on this. 2025, the government is going to exclusively use reports from Alara Imaging to report doses from radiologists who will save themselves from a 1% cut in Medicare payments. Now, if that's not a conflict of interest that should be reported, I don't know what is. JAMA Internal Medicine refused to publish a letter to the editor that gave them those facts. That's not responsible medical journalism.
Just an FYI, the ECQM has now been turned to voluntary instead of mandatory due to efforts by medical physicists group. And there is still an ongoing back and forth signature campaign, one to keep it voluntary. So the jury is still out.
The Alara web page, as of 2 or 3 days ago, still says it's mandatory. So I'm happy to hear what you're saying.
One thing that we have implemented in our population imaging studies is to correlate the amount of dose in millisieverts to the annual background radiation. And that's very intuitive for people. So you say, okay, you get 2.5, 3 millisievert. This is less than half. So is this, so it puts it in perspective. And another example that we make is a comparison to intercontinental flying, plane trip. They also, nobody cares about that. But that also causes, it's not working, that also causes a chest x-ray in dose. So that also puts people to rest because it's something that they can relate to.
That's fantastic. Next question for our panelists. At a low dose, is the risk really cumulative? Is each exam independent?
Well, the short answer is we don't know. The problem is at these low doses, it's really hard to do experiments because they're so, in the noise, right? And I don't think we would ever be able to design an experiment with a sample size sufficiently large to really determine this. Unless we could get down to mechanism and, be able to understand really at the level of the DNA repair, what's going on in terms of, an induced cancer as a result of ionizing radiation.
I would say amongst the physicists, there is a school of thought that says that, every event has to be treated independently. Every irradiation has to be treated independently. Especially, say, for example, somebody goes to repeat scans. If those scans happen less than 2 months period, then maybe cumulative effect will play a role. But a maximum window of 2 months, the memory about the exposure event has completely wiped out, and the next exposure has to be treated as a new event. So again, as Sean mentioned, it is a gray area, but we cannot completely agree on. And so long as we use the LNT model, which we use currently, there is a risk of cumulative exposure. So the model has to change.
Thank you. Any other comments from other panel members? All right. Next question. Is there a good analogy from natural background radiation exposure?
Yeah, we've already touched on that. I think humans are really bad at assessing risk. And I think this is an example where, we're always being exposed to radiation. I think people maybe don't always appreciate that. And the point about taking, an international flight where you're at high elevation and or hiking at high elevation or being in certain areas where there's higher background radiation. Those kinds of things are happening all the time, right? And this is part of the way we evolved. So I think some appreciation for that probably needs to be better educated, would be benefited from better education so that we understand that radiation is part of our everyday life.
So in fact, if you look at the high background areas in the world, like India has one, Iran, China, all those areas, the exposure does not correlate with high incidence of cancer. In fact, the cancer mortality has either been the same or in some cases has even gone down. So if you use that model as an example, then you can say that low dose radiation is beneficial. Sort of the hormesis effect.
So I'm curious, when people talk about radiation risks, one of the analogies that's often brought up is airline flights or international flights. Is there any data for flight attendants and pilots showing that they have higher incidence of various cancers? What is known about that?
I did check before coming to this panel that there are incidents, slightly increased risk of prostate cancer, I believe, and breast cancer. Because, frequent flying, you get mileage as well as dosage. So, but I think the analysis has to be more thorough to correlate the incidence of excess incidence of cancers to exposure to high background radiation in the altitude.
I think that I don't know. I've looked at the literature and there's not much convincing evidence. But one of the things that I-ELCAP has done is a research study in flight attendants that might offer an opportunity to answer that important question.
Right. Yeah, I believe a lot of the initial people who enrolled were also exposed to the era when people were smoking in the airplanes. So we'd have to separate that out, but that's definitely a good avenue to explore. Okay, next question. What will get us past using the linear no threshold model? Is there any reasonable alternative to this? And how might it gain acceptance?
I think that from a political standpoint, it's very hard to go after ALARA. I mean, it's such a sensible thing, to try and protect radiation workers and children, that it's hard to go after the people who use the linear non-threshold to support the idea of ALARA. But when it conflicts with health in a different area, I think it's incumbent on the societies to step in and discuss that problem.
Well, I mean, I don't want to give ALARA a bad name. I mean, reasonably achievable is, I guess, a subjective statement, but it obviously is also meaning that you need to achieve the end goal of a high quality CT scan, right? And for the purpose of the medical indication. So, it's not always downward pressure for no reason.
Yeah, so I mean, there's talk about low dose. People talk about low dose a lot, and the right dose is really the term, the right dose. And everyone wants a low dose. No one's going to say I want a high exposure. But I think that while I'm in favor of the philosophy of ALARA, I think that it's important to balance the need for image quality. The worst thing that you can do is scan someone and have nothing to show for it.
Right. I think we've reached the end of our session. So thank you so much. Let's give a round of applause for our panel members.